Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Normally at this time, a distinguished member of my organization will give an introduction to the general program before I introduce the speaker and the discussion, but since no other distinguished members of my organization were available tonight, I am doing double duty. But I am delighted to welcome you all here in the name of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. My name is Ronald Granieri. I'm the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. I'm the host of this program, Geopolitics with Granieri, but more importantly, at least for the next 45 seconds, I am here to speak to you about the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Philadelphia's very own foreign policy think tank since 1955. For those of you who are not familiar with the activities of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, we encourage you on your way in or out tonight to pick up a copy of our schedule and our annual report. Geopolitics with Granieri is but one of the many programs that we run at FPRI in ways to bring the discussion of international affairs to the broader public, to bring scholarship to bear through the combination of history, geography, and culture. We have events coming up in the near future that I think will be of interest to those of you in the audience. Most importantly, on the 21st of June, we will be hosting Clint Watts to discuss his new book, Messing with the Enemy, about fake news and the challenges of contemporary democracy. I encourage you, if you're interested, to sign up for that event. At the FPRI headquarters at 1528 Walnut Street, we will also on Monday, we will be having a panel discussion on China and the environment, which may be of interest to you, and we hope that you will check that out. And on Thursday, General Hooper from the Defense Cooperation Agency will be giving a presentation about American defense cooperation policy around the world. If you're interested in those or other programs, we encourage you to check out our website, fpri.org, and to find ways to support an organization which lives according to the motto of our founder, Professor Robert Strauss-Hupé, a nation must think before it acts. Now about tonight's program, Geopolitics with Granieri. I will then change my hats. I am indeed Ron Granieri, your host and moderator of tonight's discussion, all of us at FPRI. Thank you for joining us here tonight, live and archived on the internet, and live this evening on June 6th, 2018, at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia. It is a pleasure to have you join us. Liberal democracy faces significant challenges across the industrialized world these days, and especially in Europe. Widespread popular frustration with recent political and economic developments has encouraged the rise of new parties that challenge the existing political system in the name of the people. Such parties as the Front National in France and the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany are often called populist, but that name says both too much and too little. Distaste for governing elites and institutions has often been the focus of demagogues, yet the term populist itself can mean nothing more nefarious than a desire to appeal to the people, a desire that should be universal among political actors in democratic societies. What makes this particular anti-elitist wave both fascinating and frightening, however, is the sense of how vulnerable traditional elites and institutions have become. Economic crisis, uneven recoveries, and misbegotten wars have each taken their toll on public confidence in elites, and the failure of elite spokesmen to offer compelling arguments in favor of the status quo has opened the door for those who want to protect the people, however defined, against alien influences, however defined. Its impact has been felt across the European continent. Public desire for radical change fueled the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom and has most recently led to the election of a coalition in Italy of parties once considered ideological opposites, united primarily in their rejection of the European Union and of Italian political traditions. In the newer democracies of Central Europe, where such parties have been elected to national government, such as Hungary and Poland, those parties have moved to reshape the constitutional order to undermine their rivals, raising concerns that populism and constitutional checks are on a collision course. Meanwhile, states such as Turkey and Russia, not to mention the growing superpower China, offer models of authoritarian development that inspire critics of the liberal order. In the Russian case, that includes both direct and indirect support for anti-establishment candidates in countries ranging from Montenegro to the United States of America. Looming over concerns about the gloomy present are examples from an even gloomier past. We have seen Europe racked by economic and political crisis before. That story ended in mountains of ashes and rivers of tears. Writers as diverse as Timothy Snyder and Madeleine Albright have sounded the alarm. Our guest tonight, Professor Sheri Berman, has studied both the history and contemporary politics of Europe and will help us sort out the complex relationship between hope, fear, and expectations. So how should we understand Europe's current political malaise? What will come next? Does history offer comfort or concern? These questions and yours will guide us in conversation with our guest, Professor Sheri Berman. Sheri Berman is Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University. A graduate of Yale and Harvard, her research interests include European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. She is the author of The Primacy of Politics, Social Democracy and the Making of Europe's 20th Century, as well as The Social Democratic Moment, Ideas and Politics in the Making of Interwar Europe. She's also written for a variety of other scholarly and popular publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and Vox. Her most recent book, Democracy and Dictatorship, From the Ancien Regime to the Present Day, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. One of the leading scholars on contemporary European politics active today, we are delighted to have her with us tonight. Welcome, Sheri Berman. So, Professor Berman, what do you think about terms like populist? Do they help us understand the current political situation in Europe?
So that's a great place to start. The term populism is supposed to kind of indicate something about the parties and the movements that we're talking about. And so the question is, what does the term indicate? Well, you already heard that populists kind of play off democracy. Democracy means rule by the people. And so populists generally think that something has gone wrong with rule by the people. And so they tend to have, therefore, a certain number of kind of defining characteristics. One is they generally feel that the people are getting screwed somehow, right? And the question is by whom or by what? And they feel that something has gone wrong with rule, right? That democracy, its institutions, as you say, are not working correctly. They're not giving the people what they need. So when we talk about populism, what we're really talking about is some kind of malfunction with democracy, some kind of dissatisfaction with democracy. And in particular, again, you tend to see populist movements defined by, again, a sense that the people, and this is a very problematic term because it's very hard to define, although it seems pretty straightforward, are not being respected, responded to, and represented, and that rule, the institutions of democracy, are not functioning correctly. And so populists are defined by, again, this kind of sense that something has gone wrong with democracy and that it's their job to kind of fix it or address it.
Mm-hmm. And what about the tension between terms like populism and terms like illiberal or anti-liberal? What use do they have in understanding this discussion?
So populism, because, again, it's sort of a manifestation of dissatisfaction with democracy, doesn't necessarily have to be bad, right? It could be a kind of corrective, right? The term populism originated actually in the late 19th century in the United States. It was referring to movements that arose around that time that were upset, again, with the way democracy was functioning, feeling that certain people, farmers and others, were getting kind of their needs were not being responded to, that changes in capitalism, that changes in markets were threatening their way of life, and politicians and parties were not responding to those needs. And in a way, actually, they turned out, therefore, to be a very good corrective. Many of their ideas became embedded in progressive movements, in other political parties, and eventually, actually, in some of the policies that defined the New Deal. So that's positive, right? They brought to attention, again, groups and issues that were not being represented. But they can also slide off into problematic directions. So by questioning who the people are, sometimes the response is, well, the people have enemies. And those enemies we need to get rid of. They need to be purged from society or purged from governing institutions. And there's a tendency, therefore, for populists to slide into illiberalism and anti-pluralism. That can be very dangerous. Similarly, right, the criticism of institutions can be helpful. It can remind us that they're not working well, that they're not responding to the needs of the people. But sometimes that criticism sheds off into, well, we should get rid of those institutions, or we should work around them, or we should change them in ways that make them entirely different from the way that they were originally designed. That can also slide into problematic territory as far as democracy is concerned.
And that slide into problematic territory leads me to the next word I want to get us on the table. If we're going to talk about politics and illiberalism and populism, we need to talk about fascism, a term that Madeleine Albright uses at the title of her book, which you reviewed in the New York Times Book Review, and which has been on the lips of many critics of the various populist movements of today. I know you've also written an article with the title, Populism is Not Fascism, so clearly there's a difference between the two. What do you think are the reasons why people would use a word like fascism, and what do you think are the reasons why we shouldn't?
Well, I mean, I think people use the term fascism partially because they're scared, and they're worried about the fate of democracy, and they're concerned about some of the trends that they see going on in European, American, Western society. I would be very cautious about using that term. Fascism means something very particular. It refers, obviously, to movements in the 1930s in interwar Europe. And the most obvious difference, not the only, but the most obvious difference, is these were explicitly anti-democratic movements. These were not movements that wanted to improve democracy, that wanted to make democracy more responsive. These were movements that were antithetical to democracy, not just anti-liberal, but anti-democratic. And they had a very clear ideology about what they wanted to replace liberal democracy with, and it was not liberal and it was not democratic. The difference, therefore, most obviously, is that populists in the West today don't claim to be anti-democratic. They claim to be, again, trying to respond to democracy's failures, to make it more democratic, but they are not putting forward a full-fledged ideological alternative to liberal democracy as fascists were in the interwar period. There are other important differences, but I think that's crucial in not only in understanding the nature of the movements, but in how we can respond to them. And
I guess one of talking about different terms people use, we use them because when we use them, we know what people are going to think of when we use them. And so this is an interesting question about when we try to make historical comparisons. I know in your work you try to make historical comparisons. How should we use historical analogies to understand current political movements? Do you have any rule of thumb for how you keep yourself from going too far, or?
Well, I mean, I would say first of all, be careful, because history can be incredibly helpful, but it can also lead you down the wrong path if you're not careful with your generalizations and if you don't know what the specifics of different situations are. So, I mean, I think the reason why people look towards the 1930s and towards fascism, as I said, is because they're nervous and they're scared. And that's totally reasonable. But what we can do then is think, okay, what is it about the 1930s that was similar, and what is it about the 1930s that was different? So one thing I pointed out again is fascist movements were ideological and anti-liberal and anti-democratic in a way today's populist movements are not. But more generally, the 1930s was a period of crisis that was much deeper than the crisis that we have today. And those things are related, right? We had a Great Depression that's nothing like the economic crisis we have today. We have a lot of problems in this country. We have a lot of economic problems in Europe, but they're not like that. We had incredible social dislocation in the 1930s, again, in a way where we see some echoes today, but certainly nothing like the kinds of social divisions that existed in interwar Europe. And you had cultural shifts also, again, that were of an order of magnitude different from today. So I think what we see are kind of pale echoes, which is why people, I think, look to the 1930s. But the very fact that the level of crisis was different means we should be cautious about being too apocalyptic, I think. But lessons are there, cautions are there, and we should be aware of those as well, I think.
I guess I am curious, the question of should we be, since you point out correctly that the crises today are not nearly as bad as the 30s. And yet, at the same time, people look around and it looks like parliamentary democracy, constitutional government has been hobbled by deep divisions and isn't working terribly well. Should we be comforted by the fact that democracy is having such a terrible time when the economy is really not so bad, because it could be even worse if the economy was worse? Or should we be especially worried that even in a time of minor or sort of medium-level economic crisis, democracy is breaking down?
So, look, I mean, what we're seeing today is a confluence, I think, of a lot of disruptive factors, right? So Economically, right, the United States overall is not doing very bad, but we see very deep levels of inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality, regional inequality. These are very disruptive. And again, they're changing the status of different groups in different regions. We've seen a large amount of social change. This is not only immigration, but this is the mobilization of minority groups that hitherto have not been so powerful and so vocal, and immense amounts of cultural change more generally that have happened since the 1960s, combined with, as you said for your, I think your next talk, or one of your next talks, incredible changes in technology, communications technology, social media that has really changed the way people interact with each other and interact with politics. So this is a lot of stuff coming together at the same time, right? But we've had periods where democracy has been disrupted before. I mean, I think the one that's probably familiar to many people in the room, I'm guessing, is the 1960s, right? Where we also had deep questioning about the functioning of our system, about whether certain groups were being incorporated and represented, and again, a lot of turmoil. Now, in that period, actually the turmoil in many ways was much more significant than we have now, much more protest, much more violence in Europe, decent bit of terrorism. But the system did manage to recalibrate. Mm-hmm. And so the question really today is democracy able to overcome the kinds of challenges it's overcome in the past, or is there something either different about these challenges, or has democracy become weakened in such a way that it's no longer able to respond to new demands, new concerns, new problems?
Now that's a good question. But related to that is you mentioned the 60s, so we know how the crisis of the 30s was eventually resolved in favor of democracy. It just took a lot of terrible things to happen. The crisis of the 60s didn't require the same level of terrible things, and things settled down. How do you imagine, is there something we should look for which will sort of show that we're on the road to recovery? Do crises like this, in your experience, in your research, do crises like this lead to a particular kind of sort of crisis that the fever breaks and things get better? What is it that makes that happen?
So, I mean, that's a great question, and that's a place where maybe, you know, again, you might want to look to history. I mean, if we think about the 1960s, I mean, basically what happened there was you had a new set of demands arising in Western societies, generally for incorporation of women and minority groups, of new issues, environmentalism, cultural change, things like that. And eventually what happened is mainstream parties, let's say parties of the center-left and center-right in Europe, also in the United States, changed accordingly, right? They managed to kind of incorporate these new issues without alienating too many of their traditional constituencies, right? And so that's kind of what democracy is supposed to do. It's supposed to kind of recalibrate. Its institutions, its political parties, its elites are supposed to change, right? They're supposed to take new demands into the system and process them, right? So what we're looking for now, right, is an ability on the part of elites, parties, governing institutions, those kinds of things, civil society groups to some degree, to be able to incorporate these demands in a way that doesn't alienate too many other citizens, right? And I think what we're seeing now is a real groping towards trying to figure out how that's to be done, more on some parts of the political spectrum, in some parts of the political system than others, again, depending on the country. But that's what we want to be looking for, right? To see whether the institutions that we have are able to adjust or not. Because if they're not, then either you have some kind of systemic problem, or you have to have new institutions that come to take their place. But we're clearly in a period of that kind of grappling now, I think.
Right. And that makes me think especially of the current situation in Italy, right? And the idea that we have a government coming into power, which of two political movements that come from different parts of the political spectrum but have sort of grown toward each other in a common populism. And so formerly a very right-wing party and a party whose roots are in the left. Does the emergence of these kinds of populist coalitions suggest that our traditional division between left and right is no longer useful or no longer helpful?
So that's also a great question. I mean, one thing I would say to step back from the Italy case that's also instructive is, in Italy, actually, what you have today, I mean, this is probably true more generally, but it's particularly clear in Italy, is the culmination of some very long-term trends. The Italian party system collapsed many, many years ago, right? So this party system that sort of structured Italian political life after the Second World War, that disappeared. It exploded basically a generation ago. And so to some degree, the reason why you have these two now populist parties, right, that are more anti than they are pro pretty much anything, is because you no longer have really a political establishment in Italy, right? It just simply disappeared. And so this is also a very cautionary tale, right? This is what happens when your political institutions become so corrupt that people decide just to get rid of them, right? So now what we have is, in Italy, right, a government formed by two parties that are opposed to the established order, both at the European level and at the national level. And that anti-stance, right, is stronger than the fact, as you said, that one party started on the right, the League, and the other party started as a kind of weird mishmash that wasn't really on the left, but certainly wasn't on the right either. But what they're joined by is a dislike of both, again, the European and the national level establishment. And that has pulled them together in a fairly unholy alliance that one worries about, not just because one might not like their policies, but one wonders about their ability to govern overall, right? So this is kind of, again, a very cautionary tale. I think it tells us something about populists, right, which is that they're so opposed to the establishment that even though they ostensibly may seem to be on different parts of the political spectrum, what joins them as populists, right, is, again, their opposition to the existing order, elites, institutions, et cetera, et cetera.
And if we think of, if populism is partially the result of a failure of traditional elites and establishments, what do we get when populists fail?
So that's a great question, right? Which we may very well now be seeing, right? So the question when a place like Italy comes under a populist government is, right, what happens if this government can't solve Italy's problems, right? Which is pretty much where Italy has been now for a generation, right? Existing elites and institutions have not been able to address many of the concerns that Italians have. And that's an actually pretty scary thought, right? Because populists, ostensibly, again, are playing by the democratic rules of the game and are there, again, to bring democracy back to the people. And if they can't do that, if they can't solve the problems, then one worries about what might come next, right? So this is another question that comes up in a place like France, right, where you have someone who ran against the establishment but is a centrist, right? And so if he doesn't manage to solve some of France's problems, right, then the alternative in France remains the National Front. Just like in Italy, it remains the alternative for Germany, which is another party you mentioned before.
Yeah, and I guess, because that's what I can't help think about this, that when populists fail, populists never fail and say, well, I guess we were wrong, right? They fail and say they were thwarted by the enemies of the people, right? The deep state is responsible, for example. And I guess there is the connection between sort of the rise of populism and a conspiratorial approach to politics it can be a very dangerous and toxic mixture. That's not a very good question. That's just an observation. But I actually do have a question that I want to ask you though, related to this, and that is that do you see do the various populist parties and movements that have arisen across Europe, is it possible to confidently link them to each other, or are we talking about, is every populist movement in every nation sui generis?
Well, I mean, every country's different, and every country's policies are different, and every country's politics are different, and what the people are looking for is a little bit different. So, yes, in Italy, populists are addressing slightly different concerns than populists are addressing in a place like Sweden or Germany. Again, they have this common sense that, again, the people are being ignored or not represented or responded to, and that, again, existing institutions are not working well. But the particular problems each country has, sort of differ a little bit, and therefore the people who are voting for populists vary from country to country. So in some European countries, populist parties are drawing a huge number of working class voters, for example. So we've got a lot of working class voters voting for the Front National in France and for the Freedom Party in a place like Austria. In other places, actually, populists are not drawing that many working class voters. They tend to draw more educated and some higher income groups, some Germany, for instance, gets a decent number of those. So again, it really depends on the problems the country has, but again, they all share this kind of sense that there's this kind of, again, something has gone wrong with the existing order, and it needs to be attacked from the outside.
Right, and there are of course individuals who are trying to make something international about this. I think about Steve Bannon's European tour, right? He wants to show up every place and take credit for what's developing. And so there's that, but also the role of, let's say, broader international spoilers. Like, for example, the role that Russia plays in encouraging certain kinds of parties. It's too much to say that these external forces are making these populists exist, because they're already there. But what do you see as the interplay between conscious efforts at encouraging international connections and the sort of the further development of populism in Europe?
So, I mean, I would differentiate those two things, as you already have, right? So, for someone like Bannon, right, being able to say, look, populism is on the rise, particularly right-wing populism. He's not visiting Syriza or Podemos in Spain, which are sometimes characterized as the populist parties of the left. It's a way of sort of saying, look, we are the wave of the future, and it's therefore legitimate for you to support and vote for us, and we have, again, kind of momentum on our side, and we are the ones who are going to kind of respond to the West's problems, decline, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, it makes sense because it's a way of kind of, again, supporting like-minded movements and giving legitimacy, and again, also signaling to voters, hey, look, you know, people have voted for Trump in the United States. People have voted for the League in Italy. It's totally kosher for you now to vote similarly because people are doing it elsewhere and these parties are in power. I think the Russia thing is a little bit of a canard, actually. I mean, there's no doubt that Russia is meddling in elections, but this kind of thing has been going on forever. The question really is, why are they able to have an impact today more than in the past? I mean, this is really part of what Russia and, frankly, other governments have done for a long time. I mean, clearly what's going on is the Russians are exploiting weaknesses in democracies. We can see this very, very clearly in the United States. If you look at the kind of propaganda that they're putting out there, they're hitting fissures in our society. And so if those fissures didn't exist, if those sore spots didn't exist, they would be much, much less effective. So while it's not unimportant, I think, again, we have to see the ability of them to intervene as reflecting weaknesses in our system rather than them causing those weaknesses themselves.
That's a very good point, yeah, I guess. And if democracy were stronger, this wouldn't be an issue. And speaking of weak institutions that encourage criticism, one of the things that one does see in a lot of these populist movements is very strong Euroscepticism and criticism of the European Union. What, if anything, do you think the European Union can or should do to respond to the populist charge? Because I think that there's the potential for, you know, if the European Union tries too hard to become stronger, they will merely then reinforce the populist message that Brussels is trying to control their lives. So what should, say, the states who believe in the European Union, the governments that believe in the European Union, what should they be doing in order to help to make the institutions work?
Yeah. So, I mean, in Europe, this is obviously a huge issue, and it's one that joins almost all populist parties, right? Opposition to the European Union and to the euro in particular, right? And that reflects, again, this kind of general profile, right? Which is the European Union is seen as being non-democratic, non-responsive, as imposing policies antithetical to the wills of the national people. And so it's an easy boogeyman for precisely the kind of populist rhetoric that populists are known for, right? And so what is the solution? Well, one thing would be to have policies that were less unpopular, particularly in the economic sphere. So austerity has been both economically counterproductive and very problematic for a lot of countries. There are other issues too, right? So immigration issues and border issues are very difficult, right? But the real problem here is the ability of populists to exploit not just a dislike of the policies, but a sense that they are being imposed without, again, the will of the people having been heard. And so I think what we're seeing here in Europe is this kind of, again, perfect storm of policies that a lot of people don't like. But equally pernicious or problematic is the fact that they feel that they didn't have any say in those policies, that they're being imposed by people for whom they didn't vote, that do not have their interests at heart. And so this combination is very deadly. So clearly what you have to have at some point is some kind of recalibration, right? Either folks have to feel like the European Union, its institutions and its policies are actually responding, that there's a more direct connection between what people want and what the European Union does, or it needs to scale back what it does, because otherwise this ability to exploit the idea that these policies are being imposed on people without them having a say is going to remain an incredibly vulnerable point, I think, for the European Union.
Which do you think is more likely? That the European Union will simply pull back, or that there will be, because Emmanuel Macron talks about wanting to give the European Union more élan, but he can't do it by himself.
Right. Right. Well, so you've seen both of those things thrown out there. So Macron, for instance, wants to go in the direction, okay, let's make the European Union more political, more of a political union, right? So we can layer on to these policies institutions and mechanisms to make it kind of more responsive to the people, right? But there are a lot of folks who don't like that, right? And so the alternative response is, well, we're just going to pull back, right? The bad response, right, which is what the populists now say they want. Okay, fine, we don't necessarily want to get rid of Europe. We just want it to step out of interfering in our immigration policies, in our budgetary policies, blah, blah, blah.
We want to keep those subsidies coming, though, right?
That's right. Keep the subsidies coming. Everybody wants their subsidies, right? The more problematic position, in the sense of being not particularly rational in some ways, is the German position, right? Which is, we want to impose certain kinds of economic policies, but we're not willing to give up more of our sovereignty in order to make those policies, again, seem actually democratic. That strikes me, again, as a little bit of the worst of all worlds. But which way the European Union is going to go is hard to say.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna give you all a chance to warm up for the start of your questions by asking one more, and that is the question of existing European political parties. Right? You've done a lot of work on the center-left, on parties like the Social Democrats in Germany, the Socialists in France. Those are the parties that seem to are struggling the most these days, and yet those are the same parties that in the immediate post-Cold War world in the 1990s, these were the parties that were the wave of the future. Tony Blair, Gerhard Schröder, Bill Clinton, right? These people were all going to lead a broad center-left coalition. What went wrong on the center-left?
So, I mean, that's a really important question, I think, for the future of democracy in Europe in particular, but I would say in the West more generally, right? It's very hard to imagine functioning democracies without strong parties of the center-left or center-right, because they anchor political systems, they keep the center kind of in place, and they allow for the formation of kind of stable governments in Europe where you often have coalitions. I think what happened with the left is pretty clear, right? It sort of lost its way on the two issues that define European politics today, on the issues of economics and on the issues of social, demographic, cultural change, right? And so the thing that folks like Schroeder and Blair and Clinton in the US did was they were too uncritical of changes in capitalism, globalization, and markets. Now, at the time, it seemed like everything was growing great, so that made perfect sense. But when things went south, what happened was the left, which had normally been the place where you look for kind of economic alternatives, had kind of thrown in its lot with neoliberalism and globalization to the point where they didn't have an alternative to offer. And so those who were upset about things that were going on were like, well, what's the point of voting center-left? There's nothing different there. And then on immigration, you had a kind of similar thing, right? People who were disturbed by the pace of change, who felt uncomfortable by the pace of change, who had been perhaps upset with, again, the erosion of traditional values since the 1960s. Parties of the left became largely parties of the cultural elite, like folks like us in this room, and very much, again, lost the ability to speak to those concerns in a way that was still, again, within the context of both liberalism and democracy. And so, again, when these challenges really came together at the beginning of the 21st century, center-left parties didn't have distinctive, different, viable, attractive solutions to the questions and the concerns that voters had. And so people just fled from these parties. And a lot of them fled to these populist parties. And that's what we've really seen now undermining the functioning of democracy in many European countries. The inability to form majority coalitions in places like Germany. That's no longer a possibility on the left anymore. The votes are just not there to form majority coalitions on the left. And this has really destabilized democracy in a whole set of new ways.
Questions from the audience? Yes, right there in the back. Eli will bring you the microphone.
Another destabilizing influence will be the cultural, social elements with the immigration. You have European demography going downwards, and so what do you see as the sort of the impact of this wave of immigration and the fissures that are, as to use your very good word, are happening?
So, I mean, this is clearly one of the main challenges facing European societies, many of which don't really have a history of immigration in a way like we're used to in the United States, although clearly even with our history of immigration, it's still a difficult process of change to manage, right? And so clearly what's going on now is a process of kind of recalibration, right? So there are lots of societies that are dealing with this for the first time. This is particularly problematic in the East, where for obvious reasons, that is to say many decades of communism, and the fact that these are very new nations. Any kind of thing that's seen as threat to cultural homogeneity is very, very difficult to deal with. And here's where history matters, because these countries simply do not have any history of dealing with these kinds of things. But even in Western Europe, right? Even in Western Europe, we've seen unprecedented levels of change. I mean, really unprecedented levels of change. Now, probably most of us in this room think that immigration is a good thing, right? That it can make society stronger. But the pace of change, especially when combined with the economic changes that have occurred over the last years, have really created, again, these kinds of fissures and these concerns. And I think what needs to happen now is governments need to step back and think about ways of addressing these issues so that people's concerns can be addressed without, again, feeding into some kind of racism and xenophobia. So there's clearly a kind of disjuncture here between the pace of change that has occurred socially and economically, and the ability of governments to come up with policies to help societies adapt. With regard to immigration, that means both the immigrants themselves, that is to say new citizens, and old citizens, right? So this is clearly a time when we're going to see whether or not institutions, parties, and elites can come up with those kinds of things. But it has to be done, yeah.
Yes, right here.
The assumption in the discussion seems to be that polities are run by elites, and that elites ought to be responsible, and generally speaking, they are, unless something goes wrong. But I would question that assumption, especially on the basis of what we've seen, forget about longer periods, but certainly since the end of the 1960s, where we've seen a steady, essentially unfettered rise of globalization, monopolization. Nobody even talks about monopolies, the enormous power of corporations that have more money than whole nations combined, and the growth of inequality such that we see a handful of people with as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. These are long-term factors. Political elites, whether they're conscious of the disruption they cause or whether they're simply in the hands of economic forces that they are subservient to, have not responded to these things, and I see no particular indication that they will. So populism seems to me a wholly predictable, although in a sense superficial response to this. And I am wondering what sort of political mechanisms you think could be called upon to actually make a change in this situation with a coming global climate crisis that's going to exacerbate it all the more.
A lot going on there, but a lot of very tough questions, right? Elites, this didn't all happen all at once, and so does the fact that the elites are having a crisis show that they've failed and perhaps don't deserve another chance?
So, I mean, I think what you've done is kind of enunciate a sort of a rationale, so to speak, for populism, right? Which is precisely the sense that our governing elites and institutions have not done a good job of thinking about the people more generally, right? So what I think you're saying, right, is look, if we look at what our elites and institutions have done over the past generation, they've been much more responsive to some sectors of society as opposed to others, right? So they haven't thought about the social good or the public good more generally, but they've grown too responsive to the interests of, whatever, corporations or the wealthy, right? That's, again, a reason why you get populism, right? When the sort of democratic system has been out of whack, right? It's not just that people should be able to vote. It's not just that people's votes should be counted, it's that those votes should count for something, right? And there's a general sense among a lot of people that that isn't the case anymore in a lot of democracies, and so they're willing, therefore, to vote for populist parties whose platform is, I'm your representative. I'm the voice of the people, because the voice of the people has not been heard, right? So, I mean, I think what you're doing is in your own way kind of enunciating why populism has arisen, right? And so therefore making us aware that even if we don't perhaps agree with populist parties and politicians, that they are sort of reflecting again a real failure in our political establishment, right? So then your second half of your question is, okay, so I get why people might be upset, resentful, dissatisfied. What can be done? Well, again, here's where the question that was asked, I think, in a different way before comes up. Do the existing institutions have the ability to adapt, right? Can they change, or have they become so co-opted by special interests or by certain groups as opposed to others that they're not able to do so? I mean, I think this is what we're figuring out in the West today, right? In Europe, you've seen the rise of some new parties, populist and others, right? In some places like France, it's taken the manifestation of a kind of radical centrist, for whatever the heck that means, right? But again, opposed to the establishment, promising to kind of shake things up and do things differently, right? So the question is, can that really happen, right? Or are we going to see that populists are the only ones who are able to enunciate some alternative to the status quo? If that's the case, right, then the future of liberal democracy is not going to be a shiny, happy one. It's not going to be like the late 19th century in the United States, where the system does manage to adapt.
Related to that, listening to both the very good question and your very good answer, is the question of whether since a lot of populist movements or a lot of critical anti-establishment leaders in general like to appeal to the idea that they're going to bring back a glorious past, they're going to make country great again, and yet. The question of whether a particular glorious past that people are looking to, let's say the post-war decades of the stable European welfare state and the growing economy, that may have been simply the product of a particular time and place. That the European countries that had those welfare states also had relatively stable demographic profiles. There was not mass immigration, and that it may not be possible to have a successful, and this goes back to the problem of the center-left, it may not be possible to have a generous welfare state in a society that does not have cultural cohesion. And if that's so, then there is no going back. And if that's so, then where does that leave us?
Well, those are depressing questions. I think this actually gets back a little bit to the question that this woman asked before, right? So you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that characterized the post-war world in Europe, right, was a much greater degree of social and cultural homogeneity. I wouldn't, you don't want to overemphasize that, but certainly, again, there's been a huge amount of social and demographic change in the last generation or so, right? And so a question that a lot of people are thinking about, again, is can we recreate, not in exactly the same way, but in its broad outlines, this kind of social welfare capitalism, right, in a world where we can't take national or social cohesion for granted? Well, I mean, this is the kind of challenge, to get back to your question, I think, that politicians and parties are supposed to be able to address, right? So can we recreate a sense of the national community in a world where we can't take everyone's background for granted, right? Now, this is an interesting question for us in the United States, right? Because this is to a large degree been the challenge that we've faced through our entire history, right? We've done a not bad job with regards to immigrants, but we have a big black spot in our, so to speak, bad use of the term, or perhaps correct use of the term, in our own history, right? Which is integrating African American citizens fully into our national community was something that we first really started doing even in a political and legal sense in the 1960s, right? And there are a lot of scholars who believe that, in fact, one of the reasons why we do not have a very advanced welfare state in the United States is precisely because of these kinds of racial fissures in our society, right? And so the question then is, if you introduce these kinds, something similar, right, more social and cultural diversity into European societies, does that mean that you can't have strong welfare states? And this is, I think, one of the challenges that Europe is grappling with today, right? There's no reason why you can't change the nature of what your national identity is, but this is something that doesn't happen overnight, right? That you can bring people into your national community. I mean, historically, this is what the process of assimilation in some degree was supposed to be about, and it has happened before in other places, But this is, again, one of the things that I think European societies, and in a different way, American societies grappling with today. Can we recreate a sense of common purpose and cohesion that allows us to have an active government and a relatively strong social safety net in a world where the profile of our societies is changing to some degree?
Yes, right here, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Berman, I'd like to raise a subject that you haven't mentioned at all, and that's the role of the professional military in changes in society. In the West, professional military are some of the most powerful institutions in the country. They're generally controlled by civilian government, but in the rest of the world, the military plays a big role in political stability. Even on the fringes of NATO, Turkey's had a military government. So how do you see, is there a tipping point where the military in even the United States or Italy would see itself as the responsible party to guarantee stability?
Well, let's hope not, because that's definitely not a sign of democratic health, and it's not compatible with democracy. Obviously, you have to have civilian control over the military. I mean, this has become a bigger issue in countries where democracy is relatively young. So you mentioned Turkey, for instance, which obviously is not only a new democracy, but one that has a long history of military intervention in politics. And so keeping the military under civilian control is one of the defining features of democracy. So if you begin to see in a country the military saying, okay, look, it's our job to maintain order, it's our job to maintain national unity, we can better, again, govern than the corrupt elites, that's a pretty good sign that you're in for some major trouble, right? So if you were beginning to see something like that in European countries, then again, you should be very, very concerned. I mean, to some degree in Western Europe, militaries have become so eviscerated that they're no longer the potential threat to democracy they might have been, for instance, in the 1930s. But that's not true, as you mentioned, on the periphery of Europe and in a lot of other countries where the military is one of the only sometimes strong national institutions that exists, which is what makes it so potentially problematic for democracy.
Let's go. Oh, wait. A question from the web, please.
From Lawrence Husick. Is universal public education a potential response to respond to forces that are disintegrating societies?
So, universal public education. What do you think?
Well, I mean, we have universal public education. The question, I guess, is probably more about, do we need some kind of new civic initiative to kind of reintegrate societies? I mean, historically, that's what one of the things education was supposed to do. It was supposed to create citizens. We have a tradition of this in the United States, the Deweyan tradition and others, right? And even more so in many European countries like France, where education, universal public education, was explicitly designed to kind of create citizens and create supporters for democracy. And we've seen a real decline in that, both in the West generally and in the United States in particular. I vaguely remember taking civics courses in high school. I'm obviously pretty old. But these kinds of things are actually not taught. And again, it's a reflection, I think, of the divisions in our society. It's very difficult to get agreement these days on how to teach even basic things about how government functions. Civics classes are not classes in partisanship, but they should be classes in what the principles of democracy are, how democracies work, how our political system works, the nuts and bolts and things like that. And so there is every reason to believe that in a time when people are questioning democracy, this would be the kind of thing that could potentially be helpful. And it's also helpful, for instance, in thinking about some of the other issues that were raised before about things like fake news and other kinds of issues, right? We need to be educating our students in how to maneuver through the new landscape that defines our political reality. And I don't think we've been doing a very good job of that. Our system has not changed very much, I think, to reflect changes in technology, in society, and in politics.
And yet the premise, that's a good question. The premise of that question, though, also suggests that somehow populism is an error that more education would remove. And yet, what if populism isn't an error? Right? Going back to the questions we've already raised here, what if What if the point is that globalization has so completely broken down the national substance of societies that that there needs to be a retrenchment and different societies need to pull back? I mean, we can make whatever assumptions we want to make about what people's opinions are. But I think that it's important for us to also reconsider our own opinions. That the notion that people vote populism because they're not smart enough to vote properly is not going to help anybody, right? And yet, so how do we have honest discussions about big questions and even big disagreements about the shape of government without? I mean, I guess because we're supposed to. When we talk about political opinions with which we disagree, we should analyze them, we should engage them, we should discuss them, we shouldn't diagnose them, because we should not treat them wrong that way. So, but this is part of the larger question about how should those who are concerned about aspects of populism, how should they approach populism and populists? Because I think about new books like Selena Zito's new book, The Great Revolt, is built around this idea that people are populists in part because the elites have condescended to them for too long. They feel as though they have no choice.
So I think there's a lot wrapped up in those questions. Yeah. So I was not suggesting that one would educate people because they're too stupid to know how to vote. I think that's both untrue and obviously unhelpful, right? Yeah. The point about education, I mean, obviously I can't ask the person who posed the question via the internet, but the point about civic education is not to teach people to vote this way or that way. It's to teach people about how democracy works, right? Mm-hmm. So you're not supposed to be giving them certain opinions or certain views. You're supposed to be explaining to them, look, this is the way our system works, right? It requires this, it requires that. This is the way, elections work. This is the way Congress works. This is the kind of things that need to happen in order to get policies passed. So again, education is not a way to kind of take people who you think are stupid or uninformed and change their views. It's a way to kind of remind them about what the values, the norms, and the procedures of democracy are. I think that's a different kind of thing. The other question about elites being out of touch, again, this gets back to some other questions that have been posed. I think that is a totally legitimate point in many ways. I think that there are a lot of people who feel, again, that elites and institutions have become out of touch and unresponsive. And I think, again, what we want to think about is ways to make them more responsive. I would, however, also suggest, again, to get back to your initial question about the role of history. We are definitely going through a period of immense change now. And again, I think the confluence of economic change, social change, and technological change explains a lot of the difficulties that our political system and our society are having today. But again, this is not unprecedented change, right? So for those of you who are historically minded and know something about the late 19th century or the early 20th century, I mean, those were periods of even much more rapid change, technological change. I mean, there were people who were born in the 20th, who lived in the early 20th century, could remember a time without, electricity or railroads or the ability to travel in any kind of way, the ability to kind of communicate with citizens outside of their relatively limited geographical, sort of location. So the change today is real. It's multifaceted and it's difficult. But again, I don't want us to get the impression that this is a period of change that is unprecedented in the modern era. That is not the case at all, right? The question is always about the balance between the amount of change and the challenges that it throws up and the ability of existing political institutions to deal with them, right? We've had change before, even more change than we've had today, even globalization, right? On some measures, even greater in the late 19th century, openness to trade, openness to migration flows, degree of technological change. The question is not, are we in an unprecedented period of change, but are we in a period of change that for reasons, again, that some of you have already asked and that you've asked, we are no longer capable of dealing with?
I have time for a couple more questions from the audience. Let's go right over here. Yeah.
So when you think about populism, would you say the spark for it in the United States was immigration, or was it more the unemployment and the social issues of rural areas, particularly the South, and the entire way that people try to explain it? And when you talk about unprecedented change, I think about, like where Lyndon Johnson came from in Texas, and someone in Alabama where, they're looking for the institutions to do more, but they didn't know, each one didn't know about the suffering of the other. Now we have this social media where they can, oh my God, there are more people like me, and we should get together and do something about it. So the first question, which one sparked the populism? Is it immigration, or is it the economic and political and social happenings of Marion, Indiana?
So again, sort of great questions. I mean, and political scientists have spent a huge amount of time combing through data, trying to kind of get to some of these root causes. So, and despite the fact that they've done that, they don't agree. But here's what I can tell you social scientists have found. So there's actually relatively little connection between an individual's personal economic situation and their tendency to vote populist in the United States, let's say for Donald Trump. So you think that people who are unemployed in manufacturing jobs, who live in areas that are relatively depressed, that these people have a higher tendency to vote for Trump than others. That's absolutely not true. We hear a lot about working class votes that flipped, but that's a relatively small percentage of the people who voted for Trump. They happen to have been crucial in certain areas. But as an overall percentage of sort of the Trump voter base, relatively small. So personal economic circumstances actually are not very helpful. Racial animosity, somewhat more helpful. But it's a little complicated because you also have levels of racial animosity that have been going down over the past generation. But one thing social scientists have found is that they've been very successfully triggered or activated by Donald Trump in a way even more so than they had been by politicians before them. So a lot of social scientists think that it's not just racial animosity, it's not just the rising mobilization of minority groups and immigration, it's the fact that politicians, and in particular parts of the Republican Party, have primed these things, right? And got people more worried and more concerned about them. And so here's a place where, again, norms really matter, right? The way we talk about issues, the kinds of things that we emphasize, what people call dog whistles, really makes a difference because it takes latent concerns that people have and pushes them to the forefront, not just of their minds, but of the political agenda. So again, it's very difficult to find, I think what you used the word was kind of triggers, but there's a lot of things that social scientists have found have kind of come together. Again, not specific economic things, but a kind of general sense that things are going in the wrong direction by some people, that the United States is losing status, that certain groups in the United States are losing status, and that there's some kind of general threat. These kinds of things tend to be pretty strongly associated, for instance, with Trump voting in the United States. But it's not very simple or straightforward. It would be easier if it was, right? If it was just poor folks who are voting for Trump, let's say, just to use the American. In a way, that would be easier because we'd understand the cause and then we'd understand the policies. But it's actually not that simple or straightforward. There's clearly lots of things that are going on, and so figuring out how to address them is actually pretty tough.
One last question from the audience, right here.
I'd like to say, by the way, that Zito's book is very good. I'm about halfway through it. There's a lot of interesting things to say. One of the things that has bothered me is that people argue among themselves and discuss things without, in many cases, knowing what the words mean. They use the word Nazi, fascism, without the slightest idea what these words mean. But worse than that, and I blame this on the school system. My daughter just graduated, my granddaughter just graduated from Harriton, which is a good school. And she tells me in the class there how the teachers present the topics of the day and history. It's all very slanted. And they come home with an unbalanced view. Instead of holding discussions in the school to discuss issues, they're told what the issues are and how they should think. And this is in a good school with excellent teachers. I've met these teachers, they're good teachers. So, and you have across the country, and you have every populist person has a different issue. So you may solve the problem with one group of populists, but then others have different issues. And how do you deal with that?
So the issue of how should we approach discussions when there are so many different issues, right? How do you offer a If you can't offer a balanced book, how do you offer a balanced library, so to speak, and how you present these issues to your students, to the larger community?
So, I mean, this gets back again to some of the other questions that were asked. I mean, the goal of a liberal education is not to teach you should think X or you should think Y. It's to teach you how to think. And this gets back to the question of what democracy requires, right? Democracy does not require us all to have the same opinions, right? In fact, the very logic, the very rationale of liberal democracy is that it's supposed to be a system within which people with very diverse viewpoints and very diverse opinions can come together and live together harmoniously. I was just walking through, when I got here, the 4th floor of this wonderful museum, talking about the origins of this country, right? To a large degree from religious persecution in other places, right? And the idea was, we're gonna come here and we're not gonna tell you how to worship and how to think. We're gonna provide a framework within which people with different viewpoints and different beliefs can live together, right? That's liberal democracy, right? That's what it's all about. Authoritarianism is everybody thinks the certain way and I make decisions for you, right? So the point of education, like the point of democracy, is not to teach our students you should think X or you should think Y. It's to teach you how to think and how to interact with people who think differently than you do, but within certain rules of the game. So you said those were great teachers, and maybe they were, but if they're teaching their students you should think X or you should think Y, then they're not actually great teachers, because that's not what education is about. Education, like democracy, is about allowing different opinions to flourish, right? They should be fact-based. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And you should have rules that enable people with different opinions and different viewpoints to come together. And again, I think this is what we need to, the more diverse a society, the more varied the viewpoints, the more important it is for us to be able to discuss and respect and to compromise, not for us all to think the same. Again, then there'd be no point to have liberal democracy. So, I mean, if that's what your daughter's telling you is going on at Haverford, I don't know. I'm a teacher, so I wonder about students' views. But remember that that's not what education is about.
Now that is a positive and forward-thinking way to end this conversation. Thank you very much, Sheri Berman. FPRI would especially like to thank the National Liberty Museum for hosting us tonight and the Stanley and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation for their generous support of this program. This, unfortunately, is the last Geopolitics with Granieri for this season. We will pick up again in the fall, but I want to encourage you not only to come back to see us again in the fall, but also to look and follow the other programs that are offered by FPRI, which seeks to encourage precisely the kind of informed conversation about complicated issues and different views. That is the basis for liberal democracy. To keep up with future episodes of Geopolitics with Granieri and other FPRI events, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channels. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter, @RonaldGranieri. We hope that you will come to see us again, that you will bring a friend and tell a friend about FPRI. But until the next time we gather, until the next time we meet, and in the name of my colleagues, Eli Gilman and Rachel Hemler, who helped to produce this broadcast, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you, Sheri. That was fun. Thank you.